ואנו מכריזים בזאת
Hello, welcome to The View from Israel. I'm Barry Shaw. Australia will be having their elections towards the end of May. And already we're picking up signs of some nasty tones of anti-Israelism with suspected anti-Semitism. This is troubling, and I've invited as my special guest today, David Adler. David, welcome to The View from Israel.
Thank you, Barry. It's great to talk to you, and best wishes from the other side of the world down under.
Well, thanks. It's nice to have the support, and a lot of the support has been raised by you as the president of the Australian Jewish Association, for which we're appreciated. But give us some rundown of what's happening heading to the election. There seems to be a political shift over there, which isn't very welcoming sign so far as Israel and perhaps Jews are concerned.
You're opening up quite a large subject. The official position is that a few hours ago, the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, visited the Governor-General and initiated the process for a full federal election, which will be held on the 21st of May. So 21st of May, we will have a new government. The polls are showing at the moment, if you can believe polls, that there's a possibility that the current government could fall. The current government, which is a coalition of the Liberal and National parties, have generally been pro-Israel. But if they do fall, the Labor Party has in its platform the recognition of a state of Palestine, something we object to, but that is in the Labor Party platform. We have a more radical party, which is the Australian Greens. Although you might think by the name they're about the environment, they're actually quite a radical left party, and one of the few political parties in the world that has formally rejected the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. We're also seeing for this election the emergence of what is notionally called climate independence. Now, they're not really independent. This is a group of 18, mostly women, backed by some wealthy money through a billionaire and some other backers. And some of them, as you look into their backgrounds and look into the people they have gathered around them, do create significant concerns for us in terms of their attitudes to Israel, and even a couple of comments we've found that cross the line into anti-Semitism. So it may well be, Barry, that Australia is on the cusp of having a change in the political weather, a change in the political environment, if you will, that will not be so friendly to Israel, unfortunately.
It's interesting that you should say that one of the platforms is rejecting the notion of the internationally accepted designated IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And I always put the case here that they do so because it traps them and exposes them, their anti-Semitism behind their supposedly anti-Israel platform. So you agreed with that?
Look, I agree 100%. The thing that distinguishes the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism is that it does discuss the boundary between what you might regard as normal criticism of Israel. I mean, Israel doesn't hold itself above criticism. You can criticise Israel the same as you would any other country on the planet. But if you single out Israel to a completely different set of standards and you vilify Israel in a way that you don't criticise other countries, that crosses the line. And the Australian Greens have rejected the definition, and I would agree with your assessment that the reason they have is because if they adopt it, it could well provide some boundaries to their restriction on their criticism to Israel. Now, I should say that the two major parties, the Liberal Party of Australia and the Labor Party of Australia, have accepted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. The problem we have is that the Labor Party may well rely on the Greens in order to form government. That's one of the possible outcomes of the next election.
Let's dig a bit into the weeds a bit, and let's go to a ward in Australia has a sort of a Jewish name called Goldstein. And one of the candidates there is a lady called Zoe Daniel, who seems to have come from a respectable background as a journalist for ABC, but she has been making some very troubling statements.
Barry, you're right. And look, the ABC is Australia's public broadcaster. It's enormous. I guess it's in some ways a bit comparable to the BBC in the UK. Politically, it might be similar to the BBC or similar to CNN in the US. It's generally had a bias against Israel. It's been criticised hundreds of times for material that it's carried that is contrary to fair assessment and contrary to Israel. Zoe Daniel is a former ABC journalist. She was stationed in the US for a while, and we came across, I'll go straight to the most troubling aspect of her track record. When President Trump announced that the US would recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the embassy, something incidentally that we support a great deal and would hope that one day Australia would go down that path. Zoe Daniel was an ABC journalist in Washington, and she wrote an article for a whole range of reasons critical of President Trump's announcement. But the thing that caught our attention recently is that she said that one of the things that motivated President Trump at the time was that he could satisfy his wealthy Jewish donors. Now, not only is that wrong in fact, we know that in the US, of all the religious groups, it was actually the evangelistic Christians that are most influential, and Trump himself said that he got more recognition from the Christians than from the Jews in America for what he did. But you will, in a millisecond, recognise that the concept of attributing major political influence to Jewish money comes very, very close to a classic anti-Semitic trope. And saying that as a motive for President Trump is not really a political criticism of Israel. It's not a criticism of the policy. It's very troubling, attributing, if you like, almost the sort of thing that you'd expect to read in the Protocols of Zion, the old anti-Semitic treatise that Jews control the world through various levers, and one of those being banks and money, etc. Now, I'm not directly accusing her of being an anti-Semite, but what we are saying is that in addition to her political criticism, she's come very close to using a classic anti-Semitic trope. She's also made other remarks more recently. Last year, when Israel, as you know, was being attacked by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and over 4,000 rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel, there was a petition circulated, an anti-Israel petition here, which was calling on journalists to be even more anti-Israel and in favour of the Arab Palestinians. And Zoe Daniel was one of the journalists that signed on to that petition. So she has a recent history of signing a vehemently anti-Israel petition, and she has a longer history of having written material which is hostile to Israel. So that does create a great deal of concern. And Goldstein in Melbourne has the second highest Jewish population of that major city. So she's actually putting up her hand to represent a significant proportion of the Jewish community in Melbourne. And we're asking the question that the voters of Goldstein need to consider: is she a fit and proper person to be a representative in the light of that track record?
Yes, I can refer to the open letter that that you have said that Ms. Daniel signed, in which we see exactly the same definition that we see with anybody who's attacking Israel by whitewashing Palestinian terrorism, because in that letter, she, and I quote here, accused Israel of unleashing a brutal war against the besieged population of Gaza. But nowhere in that open letter signed by Miss Daniels, a candidate for the Australian Parliament, did she mention anything about the 4,000 rockets that Israel was responding to. Now, coming on to... Sorry, go ahead.
No, indeed, that is exactly the sort of bias we've seen from the ABC traditionally. That obviously Israel was defending itself, defending its citizens, and typically their coverage will show any destruction that occurs in Gaza and ignore the destruction that occurs in Israel.
Now, in this ward of Goldstein, I want to start this by asking you, do you see yourself or your organisation as far right-wing nutters and outright fascists? Because that's the way you were described by a community group that's supporting Ms. Daniels in the election in Goldstein.
Well, Barry, I'd wear that as a badge of honour, because it shows that what we're doing in calling out these issues is clearly worrying them, clearly having an effect. Now, the Australian Jewish Association, and anyone can check this, you simply go to Facebook and have a look at the number of followers that AJA has, and you can compare it to any other Jewish organisation in this country. And you'll see on the public information that AJA is by far the largest Jewish organisation in Australia, as measured by support and following and interaction on social media. So, it's almost a case of unless you are a subscriber to the hard green left anti-Israel ideology, then by definition you're a right-wing nutter. Okay, if that's how they want to define it, so be it. We're much more interested in policies than in labels.
There was also an article in responding to the Australian's article, which says, and I quote here, "Of course Israel is the aggressor. It's also an apartheid state." Here we go again. Do we have to spend the next 40 years allowing them, meaning Jews, to get away with literal murder just because we are all still traumatized by the Holocaust? Now, that is taking the International Holocaust Memorial definition of anti-Semitism, turning it completely on its head. In fact, probably proving the need of this definition.
Look, there's a whole series of ugly comments, not just from the candidates, but some of their staff, some of their supporters over a period of times. We came across one that we released just this morning, so I'll bring your listeners right up to date. A few years ago, Bibi Netanyahu, when he was serving Prime Minister, made the first visit to Australia of a serving Prime Minister. And as sometimes happens, there was a petition opposing his visit. And one of the signatories to that petition was a woman called Janet Holmes-A-Court. Now, her family, more particularly her son, Simon Holmes-A-Court, is the number one convener and financier of these climate independents. They call themselves Climate 200. I'm not sure why they picked that number. He was involved as an observer and possibly a funder of a court case that was taken against Australia's most senior Jewish politician, Josh Frydenberg, who's the treasurer. There was an allegation that he was not eligible to sit in Parliament because his mother was a Holocaust survivor, a refugee from Hungary, who was potentially eligible for Hungarian citizenship, and maybe he was eligible as well. That case failed, but we had the continuing thread of the same people involved in that. So as we've been scratching around, looking at the track records, we see activism, we see commentary directed against Israel, and sometimes you do scratch your head when you come across things that come very close, if not cross the line, of anti-Semitism. AJA has been a strong supporter of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. It has been given the nod by the Prime Minister, but we haven't seen implementation effectively down the line. We want to see it implemented as policy in universities and in the media and such. So at the moment, we have a sort of an approval in principle, but no real implementation, no teeth to it.
Okay, you mentioned Mr. Smollenbach. I think he's one of the campaign operators for Zoe Daniel, and he questioned the rise of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial in Australia, where he would, by saying any racism is on the rise in Australia. Quite frankly, I think with people like him, probably the anti-Semitism, the anti-racism of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred is on the rise in Australia. But I think Zoe Daniels has a problem here, because these are the people she knowingly picked, him and Sue Barrett, as her campaign operators. And yet she's saying late now, as she heads into the late stages of the campaign, I firmly believe on the right of the Jewish people to a safe and secure homeland in the state of Israel. So where does this woman stand?
Well, that's the question. If you look at her comments, things she's put her name to even less than 1 year ago, she's now trying to backpedal. She's trying to unwind it. She said that she will support the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Shockingly, she said that she didn't really, she said she didn't write the letter she signed. She would have expressed it differently. She perhaps didn't appreciate the complexities at the time. I mean, it's almost like saying she didn't understand what she was actually signing, and yet she's putting her hand up to be one of our lawmakers in Parliament. There has been a journalist on television that's used that to actually raise a question over her general competence, aside from attitude to Israel or anything related. If you're putting up your hand to be in Parliament, to be a lawmaker, you should understand and support anything you put your name to. But she's trying to unscramble the egg, and I'm not sure she's very successful in doing it. I should add that the seat of Goldstein is held at the moment by a member of the Liberal Party, whose name is Tim Wilson. By contrast, Tim Wilson is one of the members of the Parliamentary Friends of Israel. He has traditionally been a friend, a supporter of the Jewish community and Israel in this country. So Goldstein is certainly a potential litmus test seat for the upcoming federal election in just 6 weeks' time, because the choice from the point of view of our interests is very stark. Tim Wilson, who does have a track record of supporting the Jewish community in Israel, versus Zoe Daniel, who's got a track record of some quite harsh criticism, signing comments against Israel, writing comments that come close to being an anti-Semitic trope. That's the contrast. You can't have a bigger contrast than the contest that is going to be played out in Goldstein.
Yeah, I also have a note over here that some of the senior campaign operatives for Zoe Daniels have publicly called for Jewish advocacy groups like yourselves to shut up, but at the same time have compared your Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, with Adolf Hitler. What can you tell me about that?
That is absolutely shocking. I can't understand. If it was on a more trivial matter, you'd laugh at it and think that it's a bad joke. Scott Morrison has been supportive of the Jewish community. He made the announcement that Australia would support the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and the comparison is just ridiculous. But the other thing, Barry, that some people don't know is that outside Israel, on a per capita basis, Australia received the greatest number of Holocaust survivors. Much of the Jewish community in Australia post-World War II was established through the Holocaust survivors. So it's a really big deal here. And to make that sort of ridiculous comparison completely undermines the credibility of the campaign. Now, I don't mind if people want to debate issues related to Israel. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, to their assessment. Of course, we believe in free speech, but that's so ridiculous. It's offensive. It's ridiculous. It's outrageous. We will be putting up a sort of a sarcastic video very shortly. It's a song which is titled "Anything I Don't Like Is Literally Hitler." And it goes through a whole range of causes where people have used the Hitler comparison simply as a signal that they don't like it. We've decided that the way to compete with this, to combat it, is to mock the hell out of it. So we have a video that we'll be releasing shortly that does exactly that. It's nuts.
Well, I have another idea for you to promote, because if this Zoe Daniel is genuinely a climate change, green planet advocate, she should be at the forefront of promoting Israel, because Israel has done far more than many, many countries, certainly the best one in the Middle East, never mind the world, with our innovative genius, have done more to green the planet than any other country. So if she really is a genuine climate change advocate, she should be promoting Israel as a perfect example of what she claims to stand for.
What you're hitting on there, Barry, is the hypocrisy of the green leftists when it comes to what is supposed to be their foundational issue, which is to care for the climate. Because we know that Israel, the modern state of Israel, has had a massive tree planting program, largely undertaken by the JNF. And I think it is the only country in the last century which significantly increased its arable area. The drip irrigation, the recycling of water, you will see that the Green left never praises Israel for these things. And then there's the reverse. When Hamas sends over all those incendiary balloons and sets fire to the southern land of Israel, when they burn tons and tons of car and truck tyres, sending black toxic smoke into the air, there's no criticism of Hamas for doing these things. So it's hypocrisy writ large. If someone is a true environmentalist, then Israel deserves praise for a range of initiatives, and those on the other side of the boundary in Gaza deserve criticism, and we don't see this. So it's hypocrisy doubled.
Right, moving on from Goldstein, I'd like to ask you about another independent advocate. Her name is Allegra Spender, I understand, and she's standing for Sydney seat of Wentworth. And one of her campaign leaders is a woman called Blair Palese, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who has criticised your government over there for what she called her shocking support for Israel in killing unarmed children and civilians. So again, I guess she's referring to, I don't guess what, our response to Hamas's 4,000 rockets, which indiscriminately targeted Israeli citizens, whether they be Arab, Jews, Christian, or whatever, children, women. No criticism there. So what can you tell me, if anything, about this Spender and Blair Palese in Sydney?
Well, we have a slightly different situation in Sydney, and the distinction needs to be drawn. Firstly, we're talking about another seat with a large Jewish community, indeed the largest Jewish community in Sydney. It's currently held by former ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. Now, obviously, he's knowledgeable about Israel and has been supportive of the Jewish community and Israel. He's got a good track record. He's being challenged by Allegra Spender, one of these climate independents. Now, she has had people around her, and you've highlighted perhaps the most significant, Blair Palese, who is a supporter of BDS and has criticised the Australian government for any support that it's shown to Israel. Now, Allegra Spender says that although Blair Palese was there in the beginning, she's not involved in the campaign now. Allegra Spender has made a statement saying that she does not support BDS, that she does support Israel's right to exist with security and safety, etc. Now, the difference between Allegra Spender in Sydney and Zoe Daniel in Melbourne, and this is an important distinction, is that despite each of them having had people around them that have said things that are toxic to Israel, Allegra Spender, in her personal track record in the past, we believe has not made such statements. We've found nothing adverse in her own personal track record. Now, she's a typical leftist. She's into all sorts of lefty issues, climate change, transgender stuff, you name it, she's involved in it. But when it comes to Israel, some of her team have been problematic, but she personally is not as bad as Zoe Daniel in our assessment. Wentworth is the test case for Sydney. I personally live in Wentworth for what it's worth, and I have met with both the major candidates in this area to talk to them about Israel policy and other issues related to the Jewish community, such as anti-Semitism. In conversation, they've both said the right things. Dave Sharma's got the track record, and Allegra Spender has had some people around her who have certainly been problems. How much you then say that, well, she is a problem, I guess people will need to make their own judgment. We haven't made any judgment. We don't endorse any candidate or political party. Our role, Barry, is to get information and understanding on their policies that are relevant to the Jewish community in Israel, and we continue to do that.
Well, as somebody who then is living in Sydney, perhaps you could talk to me a little bit about what we saw over there with regard to these people who hate Israel more than any other nation on earth when it came to the Sydney Festival, that people almost ruined because they didn't like the fact that a major dance performance was choreographed by one of the leading world choreographers because he happened to be Israeli.
Well, you're right. This is a very worrying development, Barry, because for years BDS has had no real traction in Australia. Yet early this year, it had a major partial win, a big cultural festival called the Sydney Festival. About 30% of the artists pulled out. Some of them perhaps because they don't like Israel, others because they were bullied into pulling out. This happened simply because the Israeli embassy in Australia did something which is common practice worldwide. They provided a small amount of sponsorship for an Israeli dance choreographer to come to Australia to present his skills. The sum of money involved was a trivial $20,000, and the embassy was therefore one of the sponsors of the festival. And it's peculiar that the campaign was not to boycott this act. It was to boycott the whole festival at a time when we're just coming out of the COVID restrictions, and many of the arts and entertainment industry have earned very little money because Australia had a prolonged period of lockdowns. Now, we spoke to some experts around the world about this. One of those is Eugene Kontonovich, now living in Israel, and he was involved in drafting some of the anti-BDS legislation for the American states. And he made a powerful point which has worried us, and that is that even when BDS loses, it wins. The festival organisers did not actually give in to the pressure. The initial pressure was that they should boot out the Israeli act. They said they would not do that. The act went ahead. The Jewish community and others made sure that it was to a sold-out audience and was very well reviewed. So that part was a success. But what it's done, and this is what we need to understand has occurred in Australia, is that it's poisoned the atmosphere. If you were an event organiser, even if you weren't particularly against Israel, if you were neutral politically, and an Israeli act wants to participate in a cultural or a sporting or an academic event, and you think to yourself, well, if I accept the Israeli participation, I am going to be faced with this campaign to boycott my event. Too much trouble. I don't want this hassle. Therefore, they'll find a way to decline the Israeli involvement. This is the warning that we've received, that even if they lose, they win. Now, AJA has become, over the last few years, an advocate for anti-BDS legislation. There is no anti-BDS legislation in Australia. Unfortunately, some of the Jewish groups, maybe come as no surprise to you, Barry, but some of our community I don't know if they've got cold feet, they're not up for the fight, whatever. They're not prepared to support a push for anti-BDS legislation in Australia. We already have a draft bill prepared. It's something we'd like to see happen. Unfortunately, I can't report to you that the prospect of success is likely anytime soon. We're focusing at the moment on the state of New South Wales, where the Sydney Festival was hosted, to see if we can get any success with the state government here. We don't know. There are some people sympathetic, some not. But we think that there does need to be anti-BDS legislation because, to be honest and frank with you, I see this problem increasing in Australia.
It's a very worrying sign there, David, and this is why I applaud what you and your IHRA are doing over there, because we find in other countries, take Britain as an example, when tropes against Israel, they always convert into actions against Jews. We see it in America as well. And when the perpetrators take leading political positions to advance their views, this only increases in size and potency.
Yeah, look, you're right. Inevitably, and I guess appropriately, the Israeli identity and the Jewish identity merge. Most Jews, not all, but most Jews are supporters of Israel. Most Jews have friends and family in Israel. But really importantly, Israel plays a critical role for not just the identity of the Jewish people worldwide, but we know that at the end of the day, push come to shove, if things turn sour, then unlike pre-World War II, there is a place that Jews can go to escape suppression, discrimination, or worse. And I guess case in point at the moment would be Ukraine, where the Jewish community of Ukraine, I don't know what their future is there locally, but they know that they have a place to go. They have a sanctuary. So this is critical for a whole variety of reasons. Things could deteriorate in France, in Europe, hopefully not in Australia or America, but who knows what will happen in 20 or 30 years. And at the end of the day, there's a place called Israel, which you can call upon to be your home. So for religious reasons, for cultural reasons, and for political reasons, we feel very strongly that the Jewish community in the diaspora needs to support Israel to the extent that we reasonably can. And Barry, you can have confidence that AJA does that. It sometimes gets us into trouble. And interestingly, it sometimes gets us into trouble within the Jewish community, where there are people who would prefer to keep their heads down, not ruffle feathers, just, be quiet, whereas we stand on principle and we'll argue the Israeli case as best we can.
Well, I'm delighted to hear there's a leader of the Jewish communities in Australia like yourself, David Adler, because, to quote Menachem Begin, here in Israel, people like you, individuals in other countries as well, are not Jews with quaking knees. We need more people like you, David. We need more supporters like Australia Jewish Association. So Godspeed. And I want to thank you for your contribution for today's show. Thank you for being with me.
Look, thank you, Barry. And let me also say thank you for your work. You do incredible research. You bring news and views which informs people around the world. And we draw on your work occasionally. So thank you, and please continue to do it as long as you're able.
I hope, David, that you'll keep us informed, and let's meet again either just before or after the elections and appraise us of what the situation is there.
I think after the election will be good. Sometimes Australian elections throw up surprises. The polls can be wrong. Most pollsters got it wrong before our last federal election. So sometime after May 21 would be an interesting time to have a further discussion.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, for being our guest. If you like this video, please share it for others. I think it's an important issue. Australia, for many, may seem a long way away, but what is happening in this liberal democratic country is showing signs of things that should trouble us all. This is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel. Thank you for listening.
אנו מכריזים בזאת